I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The announcement did not arrive with celebration. It arrived like a warning. Inside the palace, King Charles had approved an emergency proclamation, carrying 3 words nobody expected to see together. Anne, Royal Guardian. Within moments, conversations stopped, doors closed, and senior royals began demanding answers. Because Charles had not simply honored his sister. He had placed her beside the machinery of the crown at the exact moment the monarchy appeared most vulnerable. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew everyone summoned to Buckingham Palace understood something serious was happening. Senior aides arrived without notice, schedules were cleared, and access was restricted. An emergency palace proclamation, in plain terms, is a formal declaration establishing an urgent royal decision when normal arrangements are insufficient. The king entered carrying the prepared order himself, and the silence made one thing unmistakable. This was not ceremony. Then Charles said it plainly. Princess Anne was being named Royal Guardian, a special protective role designed to safeguard royal continuity, sensitive family decisions, and the stability of the crown whenever intervention became necessary. The crown represented the monarchy itself, including its duties, succession, and authority. Anne did not smile. She looked at her brother, saw the exhaustion in his face, and understood he was asking her to carry a burden, not an honor. William absorbed the announcement differently. The prince respected Anne, but he understood what this meant for the future. A new center of authority had appeared inside the royal household, and he would one day inherit the system Charles was changing. He kept his expression controlled, yet his questions sharpened as the meeting continued. Anne noticed. So did the king. The tension deepened when Charles revealed the emergency clause. Anne could demand direct briefings from senior palace officials whenever she believed the monarchy's stability was under threat. A briefing meant a confidential explanation of sensitive developments, but direct access removed layers of delay and control. Charles placed his pen beside the signed proclamation and looked at her. "I need someone who will not hesitate." Anne's face changed. She knew he was speaking about a danger no one had named. Anne finally asked the question hanging over the room. "Who already knows why you've done this?" Charles did not answer immediately. William watched his father carefully, and the silence told him more than any explanation could. The title was shocking enough, but the deeper shock was still hidden. Charles had not chosen Anne because of tradition. He had chosen her because he trusted her when trust inside the palace was beginning to fracture completely. To understand why Charles reached for Anne, she was never the loudest figure in the royal family, but was the hardest to move. While others became trapped between public expectation and family loyalty, the Princess Royal developed a reputation for discipline. Now that steadiness had become something more dangerous. Charles was not simply trusting his sister. He was placing weight upon her that could divide the family. Anne had spent decades beside Charles without competing with him. She understood his moods, his silences, and the pressure of carrying the monarchy forward. The Princess Royal is the title traditionally held by the sovereign's eldest daughter, but for Anne, it had come to mean something simpler: duty without spectacle. That history mattered, because the king needed someone who knew the family personally and could act when affection made decisions harder. Charles sat with her privately after the proclamation and looked tired rather than triumphant. Anne asked whether he was certain. He answered that certainty had disappeared weeks earlier. She had expected a strategic defense. Instead, she saw vulnerability in her brother, and the trusted sister understood that this appointment had grown from fear as much as planning. William carried a burden. As heir, the prince knew that every decision touching continuity would become part of the system he inherited. When he met Anne later, he congratulated her, but she heard the caution beneath his voice. "You're wondering what this means for you," she said. He admitted that he was. The future king respected her. Yet respect did not erase the question of where her authority ended and his began. Anne answered without hesitation. The royal guardian role, she explained, did not place her above William or change the line of succession, meaning the legal order determining who inherits the throne. Charles had designed it as an emergency shield, someone able to challenge decisions before they hardened into crisis. That explanation reassured him, but only partly. Then Anne told him what darkened the situation. Charles had discussed the idea with almost nobody before signing it. Several senior household figures learned of the plan only after the proclamation was sealed, meaning formally completed and put into effect. William's concern sharpened. The king had not built this through consensus. He had moved quickly, privately, and with purpose. Anne finally revealed exactly why. Charles began drafting the proclamation immediately after one explosive family confrontation. Ordinary palace rules had failed in that room, and the king had decided they might fail again. The question was no longer why Anne had been chosen. The question was, what happened inside the palace that frightened Charles enough to create the role in the first place? Every palace crisis has a moment that becomes the dividing line between before and after. For Charles, that moment came during a family meeting at Windsor. It began as a discussion about responsibilities. It ended with voices raised, one chair pushed back from the table, and the king standing in silence while two competing visions of the monarchy collided in front of him. By morning, Charles had begun writing the Royal Guardian Proclamation. Tension had been building for weeks. Camilla wanted tighter control over who could enter family discussions. Anne resisted anything that weakened wider accountability. And William had grown uneasy about decisions passing through too few hands. A senior royal household meant the small circle of family members and staff managing official duties, access, and decisions. Charles kept trying to contain the strain through conversations, because once personal disputes touched authority, family anger could become a problem for the institution itself. Then Windsor became the point of no return. Camilla challenged Anne's involvement in a sensitive decision and argued that some matters belonged strictly within the king's immediate household. Anne refused to withdraw. William backed the need for wider safeguards, warning that trust could not depend on private understandings alone. The Queen's frustration sharpened. The princess stayed firm. Charles finally ended the meeting when the argument stopped sounding procedural and started sounding personal. Camilla pushed back her chair and left furious. Anne remained seated for seconds, disturbed by how quickly the disagreement had exposed resentment. She had expected resistance, but not this. The trusted sister now understood that any safeguard would force someone to choose between family comfort and royal stability. Charles stayed behind with William. The prince chose his words carefully, telling his father that informal promises were no longer enough. The king resisted at first, insisting the family could still manage its disagreements. William did not raise his voice. Then put the rules where everyone can see them. Charles went still. The future king had turned a family argument into a structural warning, and his father knew it. That night, Charles requested constitutional briefings, household protocols, and continuity papers. Constitutional briefings were written explanations of how royal authority, duty, and crisis procedures should operate. The monarch read them alone and marked one phrase repeatedly: independent, internal safeguard. By morning, he knew who that safeguard had to be. Then Camilla learned Anne was being considered. The Queen demanded a private audience with Charles, and this time there would be no room to hide behind procedure. The proclamation had been born from a family argument, but the next battle would determine whether Anne could actually exercise the power Charles had just placed in her hands. The first real test of Anne's new authority did not come from a constitutional emergency. It came from inside the family. Within hours of the announcement, Camilla requested to see her alone. No aides, no secretaries, no carefully prepared talking points. When Anne entered the room, the Queen was already waiting. The exchange that followed stripped away ceremony almost immediately, because Camilla wanted one answer above all others. How much power had Charles actually given his sister? Camilla understood exactly why the proclamation mattered. Anne could now request sensitive briefings and step into decisions when she believed royal stability was at risk. A direct briefing meant she could receive official information without waiting for it to pass through other family channels first. That changed the balance inside the palace, because whoever controlled access had always influenced how quickly problems reached the king. The Queen knew that protection could become pressure very quickly. Anne entered with no sense of victory. She had not asked for the title, and she had no interest in treating it like a prize. The princess also understood that even a hint of triumph would make the confrontation worse. Camilla watched her closely before asking the question she had clearly prepared. "What exactly has he given you?" Anne answered, without raising her voice. "A responsibility I did not ask for." The Queen did not soften. Camilla pressed harder. She warned that responsibility could become interference, depending on who decided something was dangerous. Anne held her ground. The royal guardian told her the role existed because Charles had decided personal sensitivities could no longer outweigh institutional stability. Institutional stability meant protecting the monarchy's ability to function even when family relationships became strained. The words landed heavily. Camilla heard more than policy in them. She heard judgment. Anne refused to retreat when the Queen challenged the limits of her access. She explained that Charles had authorized her to seek direct explanations from senior household officials whenever necessary. That meant no relative could quietly delay a concern or shape what reached her first. Camilla realized the practical consequence immediately. The trusted sister was not replacing the king, but she could now see around obstacles that had once slowed difficult questions. Then Anne gave her the instruction Charles had made unmistakable. If loyalty to one person ever conflicted with loyalty to the crown, she was to choose the crown. Camilla went still. The Queen understood that the rule could one day be used against anyone. Anne left without another argument, but the tension did not leave with her. Camilla summoned Charles almost immediately. He listened, refused to amend the proclamation, and made one point brutally clear: his decision would stand. Anne had survived the first confrontation, but survival was not control. The real question now was how far the king intended to let her go. Royal Guardian sounded ceremonial, until the palace began explaining what the words actually meant. Then the atmosphere changed. Charles had not created another honorary distinction. He had constructed a protective mechanism around the monarchy itself. Anne could not become sovereign, replace the heir, or command the crown, but she could demand answers, halt sensitive internal actions for review, and bring serious concerns directly to the king. Suddenly, the title carried teeth. Charles read the final operational briefing alone before meeting Anne. An operational briefing meant a confidential written guide explaining how the new role could function in practice, where its limits stood, and when intervention was allowed. He reached the last page, removed his glasses, and sat in silence. The king had created something powerful enough to protect the monarchy, but powerful enough to wound relationships too. That difference troubled him. Anne entered without ceremony and asked the question he had been avoiding. Did he understand what this role might cost her personally? Charles admitted that it could make her unpopular inside her own family. She listened, then answered that popularity had never been part of the oath of duty. For Anne, the issue was not status. It was whether she could act when everyone else hesitated. William remained uneasy. The prince understood the limits on paper. Charles was still sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch with ultimate constitutional authority, while he remained heir, and Anne could not rewrite succession. Yet access creates influence. and influence can alter relationships. The future king asked whether the arrangement might someday place his aunt between himself and his father. Charles answered firmly. The role existed to protect the next sovereign, not weaken him. Then the king disclosed the clause that changed everything. Anne alone could request a temporary pause on a disputed internal palace action until Charles reviewed it personally. A temporary pause meant exactly that. She could stop a sensitive decision from moving forward long enough for the monarch to examine it himself. She could not overturn his judgment, but she could prevent speed, pressure, or private influence from turning uncertainty into irreversible action. Anne understood the burden immediately. Her strength did not come from outranking William or commanding Charles. It came from access, oversight, and the king's explicit trust. That made the role narrower than many feared, but sharper than anyone expected. Then, the first confidential briefing arrived. Anne read one item twice, set the page down, and asked for an immediate call. The title had existed for less than a day when she faced the decision that would define it: remain symbolic, or prove that Charles had chosen someone willing to say stop before any damage became permanent. Anne did not wait weeks to test the boundaries of the proclamation. She barely waited a day. A confidential briefing reached her, describing a proposed change to the handling of sensitive royal correspondence and private family access. The adjustment looked procedural. Anne saw something else: a decision moving too quickly, with too few people aware of its consequences. She picked up the palace phone, requested an immediate pause, and in that instant, the royal guardian stopped being a title. Anne read the briefing again before issuing the order. Restricted royal correspondence meant private letters, records, and sensitive communications, kept away from normal household access, while the private archives were protected collections holding material not meant for general circulation. The change mattered because whoever gained access could see information shaping family relationships, past decisions, and future judgments. Charles had given her authority to stop exactly this kind of internal shift until he could review it himself. Camilla learned about the pause almost immediately. The Queen saw it as more than caution. To her, Anne had crossed from oversight into interference, using the new role to interrupt a process that others had already begun. She demanded to know who had authorized the intervention, then stopped when the answer became obvious. Charles had. The anger was not only about the file anymore. It was about what the proclamation now allowed his sister to do. Anne felt the cost as soon as the call ended. She sat alone, pressed both hands against the desk, and closed her eyes for several seconds. The princess had defended the crown, but she also understood that every future intervention could deepen resentment inside her own family. Power had arrived without comfort. Duty had arrived with consequences. Charles reviewed the file himself. The king studied the proposed access changes, questioned the timing, and then supported Anne's decision. His approval changed everything. The safeguard was no longer theoretical, and the palace now knew the monarch intended to enforce it even when the consequences were uncomfortable. William learned something else during a private briefing of his own. The prince discovered that Anne's pause had stopped the issue from becoming a larger confrontation before his father could examine it properly. The future king began to see her role differently. She was not building a rival center of power. She was absorbing pressure before it reached Charles. That realization changed William's tone completely. He asked Anne to meet him privately, away from officials and formal procedure, because there was something about his father he had never said aloud. The first intervention had divided the household, but it had also created an unexpected alliance. And what William was about to tell her would transform the meaning of the royal guardian forever. There were no advisors in the room when William finally spoke to Anne. No papers stood between them. No secretaries waited nearby with instructions. For once, the future king was not discussing protocol. He was talking about his father. William admitted that Charles had seemed increasingly burdened by the strain of holding together family, duty, and succession at once. Then he told Anne what he believed the proclamation truly represented. Charles was preparing the monarchy to survive pressure without depending entirely on him. William had asked for the meeting because his view of the royal guardian role had changed. Continuity, in plain terms, meant keeping the monarchy functioning smoothly, even when the sovereign faced personal or institutional pressure. The prince now understood that Anne had not been placed beside Charles to compete with the heir. She had been positioned there to absorb strain before it reached a breaking point. That mattered because every crisis surrounding the king would eventually become part of William's inheritance. Anne listened carefully because she knew his acceptance mattered more than headlines. The princess understood that if the future sovereign saw her appointment as intrusion, the role could become destructive no matter how carefully Charles had designed it. William admitted that he had feared exactly that at first. He wondered whether the title blurred boundaries around his own position. Anne answered without hesitation. She would never accept authority intended to diminish him. Anne then admitted something she had not said before. Her fear was not losing status. It was becoming the person everyone blamed whenever Charles made a difficult decision. The trusted sister knew that a safeguard could easily become a target. William did not dismiss the concern. He simply told her, "Then you won't carry it alone." For the first time since the proclamation, she allowed herself to believe that the burden might not divide them. William then disclosed the detail that changed everything, explaining it through a private conversation he had held with Charles weeks earlier. The king had asked what kind of person the monarchy would need when affection and duty pulled in opposite directions. At the time, the prince had thought the question was theoretical. Now he understood it had been preparation. Anne went quiet. Charles had been considering her long before the Windsor confrontation. The argument had accelerated the decision, but the trust behind it had deeper roots. Then William and Anne left together. Palace photographers captured them side by side, and within hours that single image dominated discussion outside the gates. What began as an internal emergency was about to become a national spectacle, and the world would now decide whether Charles had strengthened the monarchy or exposed just how fragile it had become. By morning, 3 words were everywhere. Anne, royal guardian. The proclamation had escaped the private language of palace procedure and become a national argument about loyalty, power, succession, and trust. Some saw Charles securing the monarchy with the one royal he believed would never hesitate. Others saw proof of deeper tension behind palace doors. But one public moment captured the mood better than any commentator could. A crowd gathering outside Buckingham Palace as the announcement dominated every screen. Broadcasters worked quickly to explain what the title did and did not mean. Anne had not replaced William, and she had not entered the line of succession in any new way. The line of succession is simply the legal order deciding who inherits the throne. Palace officials then issued a formal clarification describing her position as an emergency protective responsibility, created personally by Charles. That mattered because the statement was designed to stop speculation from turning uncertainty into panic. Outside Buckingham Palace, the debate became real. A crowd gathered as television coverage repeated the headline, "Charles names Anne royal guardian." Some people applauded when her photograph appeared. Others stood quietly, unsure whether they were witnessing stability or crisis. The palace had wanted control, but the public now had its own interpretation, and every reaction added pressure to the family inside. Camilla watched the coverage privately and understood something painful. Her disagreement with Anne no longer belonged only to the palace. The Queen could challenge the arrangement behind closed doors, but she could not undo the public image now forming around the Princess Royal as a symbol of steadiness. That realization deepened her frustration, because influence inside the family suddenly mattered less than perception outside it. Anne reacted in the opposite way. An aide placed the morning newspapers before her, and she scanned the headlines without enthusiasm. The princess folded one paper, set it down, and asked for Charles's schedule instead. She had no interest in becoming a public symbol. Her concern was whether the king was carrying too much strain beneath the attention surrounding them. Then William changed the mood without saying a word. The prince was seen leaving beside Anne, and the image quickly became the story within the story. Commentators read it as acceptance. The future king did not appear pushed aside. He appeared aligned with her. That single impression removed the most dangerous fear of all, that Charles had divided the present crown from the future one. Charles saw the shift too. That evening, the king summoned Anne, William, and Camilla together. This time there would be no debate over wording or authority. The country had reached its conclusion about the royal guardian, but he still owed his family something harder than explanation, a final emotional reckoning. The final meeting was quieter than the confrontation that created it. Charles sat with Anne, William, and Camilla, knowing each had experienced the proclamation differently, as responsibility, uncertainty, protection, or challenge. But the king had reached the point where ambiguity was more dangerous than discomfort. He had not named Anne to defeat anyone. He had named her because monarchy, in his view, could not survive if every difficult decision became a personal battle. The royal guardian was his answer to that fear. Charles spoke first. The proclamation was never meant to create a rival authority. It existed to place one trusted person between a growing problem and an irreversible crisis. The emergency framework meant the limits and powers that applied only when the king believed royal stability was at risk. William remained heir. Camilla remained queen. Anne remained bound by the authority Charles had given her, not by power of her own. Charles then turned to Camilla. He acknowledged that the decision had wounded her because it felt like a judgment on trust. The queen did not answer immediately, but her anger softened when he accepted responsibility. He did not blame Anne. He did not pretend the choice had been painless. Camilla understood that the proclamation had not been written to humiliate her. It had been written because the king feared what could happen if family tension overwhelmed duty. Anne heard something different when he thanked her. Charles admitted that the role might bring criticism instead of praise. She answered that she accepted because he had asked, and because protecting the crown sometimes meant protecting family members from their worst moments. The princess did not celebrate. She accepted the burden for what it was. William then gave the assurance. The prince told Charles that he supported the arrangement. His endorsement removed the fear that the royal guardian could divide the present sovereign from the future one. He looked toward Anne and gave a quiet nod. She returned it. Charles reached for the proclamation, closed the folder, and pushed it to the center of the table. Nobody argued. Camilla remained seated. William stayed beside his aunt. Anne no longer looked like a rival, and the king no longer looked uncertain. There was no mystery left. Charles had chosen Anne because when emotion threatened judgment, he needed someone who would choose duty over comfort, loyalty over popularity, and stability over personal influence. In naming her royal guardian, he had not divided the monarchy. He had created the safeguard he believed could hold it together. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.